everyone, and welcome to this presentation on single case designs. I want to start off by just defining what we mean when we say a single case. This used to be called single subject designs, and you might hear me slip and use that term during this presentation, but both are interchangeable. So in terms of a case, we're talking about anything from a person to a family, maybe a couple. So basically these are our clients. These are people that we are seeing for treatment, and we decide to use the tools of research, like the tools that you're learning in this class, in order to track progress for our clients, whether again it's an individual client, a family, or a couple. So the process really overlaps with what you would do in a typical sort of therapeutic relationship. So the first step is, of course, identifying or assessing the problem area. And of course, sometimes clients have multiple areas of need and concern that we have to address and work with them on. But for just illustrative purposes here, I'm just going to focus on one example. So in this case, let's say it's negative self-esteem. So after that's been identified, we would then establish mutually agreed upon goals with the client in terms of how to go about addressing this concern. And we would come up with what are called proximate goals, which are more immediate or in the short term. So for example, we could work on less negative self-talk. And then this will lead to the more distal goals, which are more long-term in terms of improving self-esteem in this case. So after this is done, then we would select a single case design that would be suitable and reasonable based on the problem area and the goals that we have. And there's different kinds of designs that we can use, which I'll go over later. But after that selection has taken place, then we gather what are called baseline measurements, or what we were referring to as pre-tests when we were going over experimental and quasi-experimental designs. Then we introduce the treatment or the intervention, and then we assess change or any effects that hopefully came about as a result of the treatment. So all this is, in terms of a single case design, is overlaying a research methodology on top of an existing process, the clinical process, in order to assess whether the treatment was effective. So it's kind of like evaluation research in the sense of all those designs that I went over, experimental and quasi-experimental. It's just that in evaluation research, we're interested on the effects of a given program on many different clients, and this is a smaller scale version of that where we're interested in the effectiveness of our treatment for one client, whether our client is an individual, a couple, or a family. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the baseline. It's similar to the pre-tests, as I mentioned in previous designs, like experimental and quasi-experimental, and really it's a series of assessments and measurements and tests just like we were going over before. Except for here, we're establishing where the client is without the intervention. So how are they doing? If it's the self-esteem case, how are they doing with regard to their self-esteem? If it's depression, what's their level of depression before we intervene? So generally speaking, a minimum of 3 baseline measurements are usually needed in order to see if there's a pattern. This can be accomplished during the initial stages of a therapeutic relationship where you're building rapport and engaging with the client. It's just that at maybe the first, second, and third week that you're working with the client, you also take these measurements to see where they're at in the problem area. Because basically we want to establish how stable or unstable the problem is before the intervention. So choosing how to measure that problem area is a crucial decision point in terms of what instrument you're going to use, whether it's something they fill out or questions that you ask. So essentially the tools of both therapy and research can be used when trying to make this decision and decide on what kind of single case design you're going to use. Okay, so let's talk about the treatment. In these cases, when we're trying to evaluate a particular intervention or treatment, it's better to provide only one form of that treatment in a single case design. If we have two or more interventions, then it will be really difficult to know which one made the difference. So that's the reason for that. But if the purpose is to just track progress, then this may be less of an issue. So if the interest isn't in seeing whether one intervention is better than another, and it's just to individually track the progress of your client just for your own purposes, then it's less of an issue whether you're providing multiple treatments and services. During the treatment phase, measurements are taken, and they're taken at the same intervals as the baseline measurements. So if you started week 1 taking 3 baseline measurements every week, then you would continue taking measurements, those same measurements, during the course of the treatment every week as well. In terms of assessing effects, the measurements continue after the treatment ends to see whether or not they're stable, if the effects were stable. Ideally, it would be nice to be able to get several measurements after termination, but sometimes, most of the time, when clients are done and they leave, then we don't follow up. So in reality, maybe 2 or more weeks of the termination process, of the weeks that termination is taking place, would be the time to take measurements. But then the question becomes, how do we assess? Remember that decision point about what instruments we're going to use. Well, once you have an instrument and you're collecting this data, how can you see whether or not your client is getting better? And the answer is, of course, graphs. So these are graphs that are similar to the ones that we've been working on, but now we're going to look at how we can use them in a single case design. So in the ideal case, this is what the graph would look like. And let me break it down in terms of what the variables are here. So over here we have weeks 1 through 20. And then here we have the Breck Depression Inventory 2, which is out of 63. And just in terms of making graphs, and remember we were talking about making them readable, I had to go up to 65 so I could do increments of 5. But these are the results for one person. So these are all just single measures, one single score from week 1 that this person took, and they scored a 51. So in terms of the single case design, what we would do is we would say this is the baseline time period. So imagine we don't actually have all of these dots here, right? So we've taken a baseline, a set of measurements, and then we have the treatment phase that begins here, right? So all of these are treatment, and every week we're getting the BDI scores. Now, what we could do, again, in the ideal case, is have a follow-up period where there's no treatment, and we're seeing if there's stability. And in the ideal case, this could go on for several weeks to see if there's long-term effects. One thing to note is your book refers to this phase as withdrawal, and I'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of the very specific use of that word. But for our purposes, follow-up, withdrawal kind of mean the same thing. Okay, so there are 4 patterns when it comes to baseline measurements and how we can interpret them. And these are found on page 297 of your book. There's what's called stable, there's rising, which means it's getting worse, the client's problems are getting worse, descending, which means they're kind of getting better on their own, and then an unstable case that's very difficult to interpret. But let's look at how this would look like in graph form. So if we have a baseline period, again, this is before treatment, and it's stable, then it would look something like this, right? The client is depressed, and it's over the course of those 4 weeks, let's say, or 3 weeks, their depression level is about the same, which makes sense because they're not getting help. Same with rising. So if it's increasing, like their scores on the BDI are increasing, that kind of makes sense because again, they're not getting their treatment. Now, if it's increasing quite a bit, then that might say, oh, it's, tell us, oh, maybe we need to start treatment here and not wait a whole other week since they are getting worse. And then in terms of descending, it's kind of the opposite where the scores are kind of getting better, right? Because the lower the score, the lower the depression. So it's a little harder to interpret in terms of whether they're getting better on their own. Unstable, it's kind of all over the place and it makes us wonder, what happened here? That it went so, the client got so much better and then they got so much worse. So all over the course of 3 weeks. So what do we do with that information? So how does this help us? So having a baseline is important to later assess effects, kind of like we talked about with, again, the quasi-experimental and experimental designs, mainly because it gives us a comparison point. If it's stable and rising, then again, it's easier to interpret in terms of, the scores are reflecting the fact that there's no treatment and so the client is at their same level or getting worse. But if they're descending, we might ask ourselves, is the client getting better on their own? If it's unstable, then we may want to extend the period of baseline measurement if it's possible to do that. I mean, after 3 weeks or so, it's hard not to really get into the therapy in some cases. So in that case, we might take an average of those scores to compare. But it's like I said, this is for your own use to track progress for your clients, to share with your supervisor. It's really kind of neat to be able to have a graph of how your client is doing when you're going through supervision, and you can talk about, points of target points for improvement if need be. Let's see. In terms of interpretation, sorry, I'm trying to remember where I'm going with this. Oh, right. Okay. So let's say we have our graph and we want to interpret what it all means. And there's really 3 types of interpretation that your book goes over. So we can say something is therapeutically effective, experimentally effective, and statistically effective. So it really just becomes sort of up to you as the clinician or, as the social worker to decide what these effects, what these data points mean to you and for your client. So in terms of the designs I'm going to go over, I want to just go over the notation because it is different than the X's and the O's that we were going over before. An A refers to the baseline in a design, but it can also refer to a post-treatment measurements that are taken. So it can get a little confusing, but once I show you the actual design notation later, it'll make a little bit more sense. But B refers to the actual treatment and the intervention. So it's kind of like where's my cursor? Here it is. The A is like the O's and the B is like the X. So O's refer to as observations. In this case, we're using the letter A, and then X refer to the intervention, and here B is referring to the intervention. If you see other letters like C or D or what have you, those refer to other treatments that are being studied in the single case design. Okay, so AB as a design is the simplest form that you can have. It just has 2 phases, the baseline and the treatment. So the A and the B. So what would that look like? If this is the graph that I've been using this whole time, then we would have a baseline here in this case of 4 weeks, and then we would have the treatment. So this is an A-B design. What happens when you have an ABA? So now this is what I was referring to in terms of it being a little bit clearer, where you would have 3 phases: a baseline, a treatment, and the withdrawal phase, or the follow-up phase, where measurements are still being taken. So this would be similar to the O, the X, and the O, except here it's an A, a B, and an A. So on graph form, again, we would have our baseline, we would have our treatment, and then we would have the withdrawal period. So this is the graph that I used before, except now you know it's called the ABA design. So remember back when I was talking about the word withdrawal? So it basically is the termination of treatment with a follow-up period. So that's why I was calling it the follow-up. But as your book says, you know, there's something called a reversal design, where in this withdrawal period, when the treatment is withdrawn, then it's kind of like seeing if the client reverts back to their previous state of whatever, in this case depression, after treatment has stopped. So there's the discussion that they have in the book about whether, you know, the clinician is purposefully trying to reverse the effect. And of course, in a clinical setting, that wouldn't work. That wouldn't be ethical. But there are certain other settings, like in terms of behavioral modification, or behavior modification, excuse me, that this might be more amenable to. But for our purposes, I'm just going to refer to this as the follow-up period. Okay, the ABAB design. So that's 4 phases: baseline, treatment, withdrawal, and treatment. And just as you would guess, we have our baseline, our treatment, the withdrawal, and then the treatment again. So in this situation, it might be the case where the clinician is trying to see what happens for a few weeks after treatment is withdrawn, in order to see if the client is still doing well, but they do have a 20-week session, so treatment continues. Now, if we were to add another follow-up time period, then that would be the ABABA, ABABA. So again, just to see if the effects last in the long term. Okay, so let's talk about the last design, which is called the multiple baseline design, which is helpful when we have clients that may present with multiple problems that we will have to be addressing. And that's likely the case for most. But here what we're doing is addressing them one at a time, or at least focusing on one at a time, even if you're working on all of them during the treatment process. But the way that we would do that is maybe using Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or mutual goal setting, where we're kind of deciding if we're going to focus on one need at a time, which is the most immediate need that needs to be addressed. So let's say our client has depression, we're going to measure that with the BDI, but they're also abusing alcohol, so we may want to measure that by the number of meetings that they attend, and maybe also whether they have clean tests, if they're required to give a drug test every week. They may also have poor parenting skills, so if we're focusing on that, how are we going to measure it? Maybe by the number of times they yell at their children during the week, like the average number versus the average number of times they use positive reinforcement. So what you can see here is we have these three issues that we may be working on with our client, and we're going to focus on the most immediate needs first in terms of the depression and the alcohol, and then the parenting skills. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you're not talking to them about positive reinforcement and behavior modification and all of that before we sort of get to that focus. It just means that the the time that's spent in any given week or series of weeks is more focused on one particular problem at a time. Okay, so what would this look like in slide form? It's going to look a little complicated when I first put it up because I couldn't figure out how to have things pop up one at a time within the graph, so just bear with me and I promise I will explain everything. And I would like to show you the graphs going from the top to the bottom in terms of the more immediate need being at the top, but I couldn't figure it out in PowerPoint, so apologies on that. Okay, so here we have a graph and it is showing us the average number of days that the parent used positive reinforcement per week. Whoops. Here we have the average number of times they yelled during that particular week that we are doing the assessment. And then we have the average number of meetings that they attended, and then the depression score. So what would this look like if we were kind of breaking it up? So we would have this baseline period of, let's say, 2 weeks. So what do we know in terms of comparison? Well, depression is pretty high. Number of meetings attended, pretty low. Average number of times yelling at their children, pretty high. And then not using positive reinforcement at all. So we're getting a sense of the severity of these different issues, their alcohol abuse and their parenting, as well as their depression. Now we would add this treatment here, and I've tried to color code it so you can see the differences more clearly. So the idea here is that depression is going to be the focus here. Again, not to say that we're not encouraging them to go to AA, that we're not working on the issues related to the alcohol abuse, because probably these two things are tied together. Well, all of them are, really. But just to say that this is in the hierarchy of needs and the mutual goals that we've set with the client, we've decided to work on this first. And then after this series of weeks, we start focusing on the second treatment, which is for the alcohol use. That's why this is green, and we have green here. So here the number of meetings, average number of meetings attended per week is gone up, right? And then we would focus after this series of weeks on their parenting, down here, in particular yelling. And then treatment 4 would focus on how to better use positive reinforcement. And then of course we have the termination period. Okay, so let's interpret what all of this means together as a whole. So here when we're focusing on depression, we see that there's improvement, right? It's going from a high here of, let's say, 50 something, going down all the way to maybe 30. And, these are kind of where they're at, because that's, again, not the focus. But, things are improving in the parenting area. Things are kind of stable with the meetings attended, and then not so much with the positive reinforcement. Then we start focusing on the number of meetings or days per week, and we see an increase, right? Because we're focusing on all the issues related to the alcoholism. Depression is getting better, so maybe this is as a result of that and the additional focus. The number of times yelled is kind of stable, but it's decreased a lot since baseline. Positive reinforcement starting to, pick up a little bit. But again, the focus is on here, so maybe it's not as much. And then we have phase 3, which is focusing on decreasing the number of times yelled, which, did happen, except for this one little point here, which is related to this little point here and this little point here. So we see a pattern here. What happened week 13, right? So that might be something we would want to focus on. Like, was this a particularly rough week? Did they lose their job this week, or did something happen that needs to be addressed? Because following week 14, things are back on track, right? Depression is back to a low number of meetings attended. They didn't yell at all during this week, and then they're using a positive reinforcement quite often. And then during treatment 4, which is the focus on how to improve parenting via positive reinforcement, it's all good. they're increasing the number of times, no yelling, attending AA frequently, depression is low, and then all of that is stable at baseline. So this is, of course, the ideal case. It won't always look like this, but just to kind of give you a starting point in terms of how you can actually do this. And then in class, we'll go over how to actually make these graphs. It's pretty much the same process that we used before. So I think that's it. No, there's more. I forgot to mention, on top of these graphs, you can also add different notations, like, if making a notation here for some event that happened to remind you later on when you're evaluating your practice. But what you can also do is combine measures in one graph. So here we have the number of days, right, that they attended AA. But what if every week we also wanted a notation that indicated whether or not their urine test was clean or not? So in this case, week 1, they had a clean test. Week 2, maybe not, right? Week 3, they're doing great. They slipped a little bit here. But then another clean test, all the way to whatever happened week 13. And then after that, it's all clean. So it's just to say that there's other notations that you can use to help you. So ultimately, this is for you, for your benefit as a social worker to use with your client. And again, if you had a whole family, then you might have different graphs for each family member. And when you're coming at it from the outside, looking at a graph like this, it can be a little overwhelming. But if you're the one making the graph, then it becomes easier to understand what you're doing, because you're the one creating, you're the one entering these data, and you're the one making the graph, so you can understand it. And then you'll have to explain it to your supervisor in terms of what it all means. Okay, now for sure. No, there's more. I thought for sure we were done. Okay, the changing criterion design. This is actually an important design where we can have incremental goals in order to achieve the long-term goal. So what would that look like? Let's say we have, we're tracking average number of days yelling per week, and we're trying to reduce that. So here we would have our baseline measure, right, during weeks 1 through 3. And then we might say, okay, our first goal for treatment is going to be to be less than 10 times a week of yelling, right? And of course, we're working on parenting, we're doing all that stuff that was in those other graphs in terms of the depression, the alcohol abuse, etc. But now we've overlain, overlain? Is that a word? We've overlaid these little proximal goals in our attempt to work on yelling. And then once that is achieved, then maybe we say, okay, let's go down 5 times a week, right? Oh, I think I gave this little point because it was supposed to be actually for 13. I was trying to mimic the previous one, but okay, whatever. So goal 2 is 5 times a week, and then maybe treatment goal 3 is going down to 0 times a week, and then we have our withdrawal or follow-up period. So this is kind of useful to show the client. Oh, that's something that I didn't mention before that is actually pretty important. You can also use these graphs in the therapeutic relationship where you're showing them their progress and how you're tracking it, and talking about, okay, well, what happened here? I noticed, if they didn't bring it up, let's say, I noticed something happened here. Let's talk about that. So it just kind of gives you another tool to help the client. And it can be nice, if you're seeing something like, whoops, come back. Well, let's say this one. I mean, if you're, if you're a client with depression and you're seeing this, it's kind of a visual positive reinforcement, if you will, of getting better. Okay, so I'm pretty sure that was the end. Yes. Yeah. I don't know why I put these things at the end of the presentations, but it's fun. Okay, that's all I have for now. Bye.